Welcome to another exciting AP Art History podcast video. And today we're going to be talking about the Greek art of the geometric period. Hi there, guys. I'm Mr. Bruns, and I want to make sure that before we get into our discussion of Greek art, particularly the geometric period, I want to make sure that you have. This is the book we use, Art History by Stokestad and Cawthron. Make sure you have looked, at least read, that introduction on Greek art and particularly the geometric period, because you need to have that sort of contextualization. Also, you can use your Barron's AP Art History Review book, and that'll help you out as well. But make sure you've done your reading, because this is not going to make much sense. And, I kind of go through things in a very skimmed fashion before we get into the artwork. So make sure you've done your readings. That's critical before you kind of get into this section. All right? So before we begin our look at art, particularly the geometric period art, we need to have some contextualization about the Greek people. And we need to begin with geography. Geography was a huge part of the development of the ancient Greeks. What we need to know about the Greek area, the Aegean and the Mediterranean area, as well as the Adriatic, is that the area of Greece is very mountainous, okay? And which meant that it's beautiful on one part, but the downside is that there's very little good farmland. So it's not a heavily agrarian society. And so what they did is they adapted over time, and they were able to understand that they could grow things like olives and make olive oil. They could grow grapes, particularly grapes for wine. And what they would do is that they would export those materials. Also, you see as these sort of city-states develop along the ports, and some inland, we see the birth of skilled artisans, and they would produce metals and ceramic wares and would trade them abroad. What would they trade them for? They would import grains, they would import raw materials. And so what happened with the Greeks is they became a very seafaring people because of their natural ports. So Greek merchant ships would go out into the Mediterranean Sea, they would go out abroad, and they would trade. And they would trade the ceramic wares. They would trade olive oil. They would trade bronze from Athens and Corinth and Aegean from around the Mediterranean. And what the impact of this movement around in the Mediterranean Sea is that it would extend the Greek culture. And that's just not so much the language or their writing style, but it is their art most of all. And within a very brief moment of time, we would see that Greek artists began to develop their own distinctive ideals of human beauty, architectural design, and it would continue to be a profound influence even on today's architecture and even in today's sculptural forms. So from about 900 BCE until roughly around 100 BCE, the Greeks concentrated on a new, rather narrow range of subjects, and they would produce an impressive body of work that focused on stylistic aspirations and a variety of media. Greek artists were restless. They never stayed in the same area. And what I mean by that is that if we compared Greek artists to Egyptian artists, particularly like sculpture, Egypt just desired to stay in the same conventions, the same stylization, to create this sort of permanence, where in the Greeks it was always evolving. Because of Greece's unique geography, what we see at the birth are independent, governed city-states, and each city-state was autonomous. They were fiercely independent of one another, and this often created suspicion between city-states. You had city-states like Athens, which created its sort of limited democracy, Corinth, Sparta, and they created political and economic and religious cultural centers that were unique to themselves. The power of these city-states depended at least as much on their manufacturing and commercial skills to keep themselves going, as well as the military might. If we take cities like Corinth, located on the major sea trade routes and land trade routes, they are one of the oldest and most powerful. 6th century BCE, we see the rise of Athens that rises to a commercial and cultural dominance, representative governments where citizens participated. Now, I say limited democracy because what really happens is that you should be able to trace your male lineage back at least 400 years. You had to earn, or not earn, but own a certain amount of land to be able to participate in the political systems. If you were a slave, if you were a woman, if you were an immigrant, well, then you could not participate in the political system. So, Athens, even though we say it's democratic, it was limited democracy. If we talk about Sparta, we are Sparta. We are talking about an oligarchy. We're talking about a military state whose one idea of art is the art of war. So you have to have some knowledge, historical, about who you're dealing with and in what area is that art being created. I've mentioned before in earlier videos that when we look at art, particularly our ancient arts, we have to kind of look at why is this being created? Is it being created for a government? Is it being created for religious purposes? And for the Greeks who were polytheistic, they had a pantheon of gods and goddesses to choose from. And according to Greek legend, the creation of the world started with this incredible battle between the earth gods called Titans and the sky gods, who would become our Olympian gods. And the victors were the sky gods. And Greeks believed that these gods lived atop Mount Olympus. Greeks saw their gods as immortal, that they had supernatural powers. But Greeks also visualized these gods in human forms. They gave them human weaknesses and emotions. They built temples that they called sanctuaries and were thought to be sacred to one or more gods or goddesses. Early sanctuaries included outdoor altars, they could have been a shrine, and a sacred natural elements such as a small spring, even a rock, and how about a tree? These were all considered sacred elements. Then later on, as time went by, buildings were added, and a sanctuary might be a palatial home for the god with one or more temples. You might have a treasury for storing valuable offerings, tribute to these gods, various monuments and statues, and housing for priests and priestesses and visitors. And sometimes you even had things like outdoor dance floors. Greek sanctuaries are quite different from religious complexes that we might see in ancient Egypt. The Greeks treated each building, each monument that they created as an independent element to be integrated with the natural features of the site, sort of like Hatshepsut's mortuary temple, in an irregular arrangement that emphasized the exterior of each building as a discrete sculpture form on display. So like art in Egypt, Greek art has its periods that you do need to know. And it begins with the geometric period. We're not going to concern ourselves with the Minoan or the Mycenaean. We're going to concern ourselves. The Greek art period really starts with the geometric. And as we move up the timeline, then we have the archaic period, which will be a different discussion. And then we have the classical. Okay? Classical is subdivided into three categories: early, high, and late classical. So we're going to need to discuss those. And then we finally finish with the Hellenistic style under the time of Alexander the Great. So keep in mind in your notes what art sets in: geometric, archaic, classical, whether it's early, high, or late. And then finally we finish the Greek art timeline with Hellenism or Hellenistic art. So we'll begin with our first art period in the Greek art, the geometric period. And the geometric period flourished between 900 to 700 BCE. And what we have a lot from this time period really that we're going to look at are ceramic wares and some smaller bronze wares. Ceramic vessels had linear motifs. Some of them had spirals. Others had diamonds, cross-hatching. And this kind of creates an abstract vocabulary. And it's strikingly different from the stylized plants and birds and sea creatures we might have seen in our earlier studies of the Minoan ceramic wares. The work that we see right here, this crater, was a tombstone. It was a large funerary vessel, and that they were developed at the time for use as grave markers, and many of which have been uncovered at the ancient cemeteries of Athens in particular. The crater illustrated here seems to provide a detailed pictorial record of the funerary rituals that were associated with a very important person whose death is commemorated by this work. We have two very distinct registers. We want to remind ourselves that that's a good vocabulary word to use, registers. We might have seen this in the standard of Ur. And what we have right up here at the top, right here, our first register. At the top register, the body of the deceased is laid out. He's depicted laying out on top of what looks like to be a funeral bier or pyre. Perhaps they're waiting for everybody to gather at this time. The funeral pyre was a relatively new Greek practice in cremation. We have male and female figures standing on either side of our passed away body. Arms are raised and both hands are placed on top of their heads. And this could be seen as a gesture in anger, anguish. It could also be seen as a gesture of mourning, because we could take it as they're literally tearing their hair out in grief. Now, if we look at the bottom register, right down here, what we have here are horse-drawn chariots and foot soldiers. So this person may have been a military leader based on this information below. They are walking with shields. They have tiny ant-like heads, but yet muscular legs and move within sort of a form of a procession. Now, this sits in the geometric period because of the shapes we see, those geometric shapes. Triangles for torsos, more triangles for the heads that are done in profile, round dots for the eyes, long, thin rectangles for the arms, tiny little waists, okay, long legs with bulging thighs and calf muscles are what has given the geometric style its names. Figures are shown in either full profile views or full frontal, and there's this emphasis of flat patterns and crisp outlines. There is no sense of illusion of three-dimensionality here in their forms, but yet this artist has also captured a deep sense of human loss by sort of the exploitation of the solemnness of what's going on, and there seems to be some sort of rhythm in the lower register in its arrangement. Greek artists of this period also produced figures in wood, ivory, clay, and cast bronze. These small statues of humans and animals are similar in their appearances, and they might have even been considered votive figures at some point. Tiny bronze figures such as we see here, man and centaur. A centaur is a mythical creature, part man and part horse. And we do know that there are wise and good centaurs, and that there are also evil centaurs. But what we have here is a theme of good versus evil. Man battling the centaur. Man is seen as good, then the centaur is seen as bad. Maybe it's symbolic of the barbarian, because the Greeks were out at some point. They were colonizing the Mediterranean region. And so when they encountered people outside of themselves, and the Greeks were pretty egotistical. They thought them better than anybody else out there. So when they encountered other people of other cultures, of other languages, they saw them as barbarians. So maybe this centaur represents this sort of battle between the Greeks and the barbarians, good versus evil. And this is a pretty common theme we see throughout Greek art. The two figures confront each other. The man, perhaps this is Heracles, we don't know. And he has stabbed the centaur, because we see a spearhead and it's visible on the centaur's left side. Body parts of these figures, such as what we saw in the funerary crater, have the elements of geometric shapes. They arrange them in a composition in a solid form. We see open or negative spaces that makes the pieces interesting from multiple views. This work is supposed to be seen from 360 degrees, so we would say it is a work done in the round. And this also suggests that the artist may have created this as a votive offering, and it may have been placed in one of the temples. So to sum it up, guys, this is where we begin. You should understand sort of the lay of the land, the geography of where this art style began, and all the different ones. You should understand the historical context that goes behind Greek art. You should understand the religion, that the Greeks are polytheistic, they have a pantheon of gods, and how is that going to influence the creation of art, such as sculpturing? How is it going to influence architectural design, such as temples? And for this particular lesson, you should be able to discuss the characteristics of the geometric period of Greek art, and you should be able to identify it. Hope this video helped you out.